Assalamu alaikum, teacher.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Teacher, recently a major massacre took place in the city of El Fashir in Sudan. And this kind of situation in many different parts of the world has started to increase and become commonplace for us. So, what should our assessment be at this point? And how should we approach this matter?
Maybe it was the week before, I'm not exactly sure. We talked about this issue. We discussed the matter between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I said something there. I said that wherever the British have passed through, they have always left behind a historical problem. And even 100 years after the British left, people there continue to clash and have internal conflicts. Unfortunately, Sudan is one of these places. That is, Sudan was under British colonial rule all the way until the late 1950s. And as many of you have probably seen in the news, yes, not long ago, Sudan was split into two. It was divided into two parts, South Sudan and North Sudan. When the British left now, South Sudan is the area where the energy resources are located. And North Sudan is where the pipelines that transport these energy resources to the world are found. Between South Sudan and North Sudan, there are both economic and religious differences. On this side, the Christians remained. On the other side, mostly Muslims and followers of Africa's indigenous religions stayed. So there is a religious problem between them as well as an economic one. And since there is a tribal system there, as is the case wherever there is a tribal system, there are also ethnic problems at the same time. Actually, war in Sudan is nothing new. After the situation in Gaza calmed down a bit, Sudan started to come onto people's agendas. In fact, there has been a war going on in Sudan for almost half a century. And in this war, for example, I'm talking about what has happened in just the last 2 years. Nearly 300,000 people have died just in the last 2 years, since 2023. Nearly 300,000 people have died. It is estimated that between 13 and 15 million people have been displaced from their homes. In fact, this is something 2 or 3 times the scale of Gaza. There is a tragedy, but unfortunately, it is not really on the world's agenda much. So why is this happening? I mean, why is there something like this in Sudan? As I mentioned, one of the reasons is that when the British left, just like what happened with the Kurds in the southeast, as I explained last week, they divided Sudan in such a way that conflict became inevitable. The second reason, now as you know, there was an Islamic coup in Sudan. Omar al-Bashir, if I'm not mistaken, it should be 1989, but I might be remembering it wrong. Omar al-Bashir, by rallying some of the Islamic sentiment there, did something in that place. He attempted a coup there. However, after coming to power, he definitely did not establish an Islamic government. In other words, he established a regime that was cruel, dictatorial, and no different from the Arab regimes we know. At first, they tried to reform some things, but later it turned into an ordinary regime. Now, since he came to power through a military coup, he could never really trust the army. Because he didn't trust the army, he formed his own army from the tribes in Sudan's rural areas. At that time, these were called the Kankavit. You might remember the Kankavit were extremely brutal, very cruel, and inflicted unimaginable torture on people. However, at that time, since they were doing this to Christians or to followers of Africa's indigenous religions, to be honest, the Sudanese didn't raise much of an objection. That is because they were on the side of the government, because they supported the state. Of course, maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but whoever has supported a tyrant, God has always punished them in the end by the hand of that very tyrant. This is an unerring, unfailing rule. Of course, as these Janjaweed gradually turned into a parallel army over time, the Sudanese government also gave them official status. So in the country, there ended up being two things, two armies. One is the official army of the state, and the other is what we now call the Rapid Support Forces, which became an army as well. After the uprisings began in the late 2010s, and they overthrew Omar al-Bashir, the official army, and these mercenaries, which we call the parallel army, joined forces. They formed the new government, the new state. But of course, as you know, there are certain rules that Allah the Almighty has set in this universe. One of these is that if there is dual leadership somewhere, it is impossible for there to be order. There are two separate armies. Each army is led by a different general, and both of them have their own interests. This is one of the reasons for the current war. In other words, the existence of dual leadership in the state. Of course, there are also external factors, that is, in the continuation of this war. For example, there's one name you've all been hearing a lot lately, that is the United Arab Emirates, which we could call the devil of the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates is supporting the Rapid Support Forces. They are inciting them against the main army. And in fact, the reason behind this massacre happening in El Fasher is the United Arab Emirates provoking them. So what exactly does the United Arab Emirates want from Sudan? First, there are gold reserves. For example, I read a study from the year 2025. The official amount of gold sent from Sudan to the United Arab Emirates is 9 tons. This is the official figure, meaning 9 tons have been sent. If you consider the unofficial amount, we can almost say that the United Arab Emirates meets all its gold needs or conducts its gold trade through Sudan to have control over these gold resources. That's one reason. Second, for example, you might remember from the news, at one point Israel bought a piece of land in Sudan the size of Israel itself. Because Sudan has the Nile. There are very large agricultural lands. In Sudan and in many countries, they meet their agricultural needs from these leased lands. The United Arab Emirates is 90% dependent on foreign sources for food. They want to take full control of the food supply there and meet the UAE's food needs through Sudan. And there's also the port, as you know. Sudan has some of the world's most important ports. They want to seize these ports and dominate trade, and through trade, control international relations. This also includes the involvement of Arab countries. These are among the reasons for the crisis in Sudan. But these are material reasons, apparent reasons. There are also spiritual reasons for this. And what really concerns us are the reasons we call spiritual reasons. I think this is the important part. First of all, let me say the first one. If a community claims to believe in Allah, the book and the Prophet, but does not fulfill the requirements of this belief, there are certain punishments that Allah gives to such communities. Now, when a disbeliever turns away from Allah, the punishment Allah gives to the disbeliever is different. The punishment Allah gives to someone who claims to be a believer, who claims to believe in the book but turns away from Allah, is different. For example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah addresses the people of the book. He mentions 4 punishments for those who claim to believe in the Prophet but do not fulfill its requirements. Those whom Allah has cursed, those He is angry with, those whom He turned into apes and pigs, and those whom He made worshippers of false gods and servants of the tyrant. Allah the Mighty and Majestic says, "Shall I inform you of something even worse?" This is the worst one. If Allah has become angry with the people, cursed them, turned them into pigs and apes, and made them servants of the tyrant, then this is one of the greatest punishments that Allah can inflict upon a community in this world. Even though the Islamic Ummah claims to believe in Allah, claims to believe in the Quran, claims to believe in the Prophet, they hardly fulfill any of the requirements of this. Set aside the outward acts. For example, which country that claims to believe in Allah and His book, which Islamic country actually rules by Allah's book? Which Islamic country that claims to be the Ummah of the Messenger is building a politics and economy or a society based on the principles of the Messenger? No, unfortunately. Because of this, Allah, glorified and exalted be He, became angry with us. Just as He was angry with the people of the book, He became wrathful with us, He cursed us. May Allah protect us to be turned into pigs and monkeys. Being transformed into pigs and monkeys happens in 2 ways. First, as the majority of the Salaf have said, it is when people are physically transformed into pigs and monkeys. Second, as Mujahid, one of the scholars of tafsir, has said, it is when a person's character becomes corrupted, when they become pig-like and monkey-like, when their hearts are transformed. Unfortunately, the morals of the Muslim Ummah are not exactly something to be proud of either. وَعَبَدَتْ تَغُوتُ. The worst of all is when Allah turns a community into the servants of false gods, taghut. Now look at almost all the lands of Islam. Almost the vast majority of us, in the major countries, people have become servants to the taghuts. And this is a spiritual divine punishment. What we have experienced in Gaza, in Sudan, in East Turkestan, and in other regions, all of it is the result of this spiritual punishment. Secondly, I mentioned something a moment ago, if you remember. When the Janjaweed were under the control of Omar al-Bashir, oppressing Christians and persecuting the rebellious tribes in the region, the Sudanese, they remained silent. They turned a blind eye to this situation because they were one of us. At the end of the day, God brought those oppressors as a calamity upon the Sudanese. There is a principle that Islamic scholars have mentioned as a divine law. Ibn Taymiyyah also says this: "Man a'ana zalim bilibihi," whoever helps an oppressor, Allah the Almighty will test him with that oppressor. They base this on a verse from the Quran. وَكَذَلِكَ نَوَلَّ بَعْضَ الظَّالِمِينَ بَعْضًا بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسَبُونَ. As a result of what they have earned, we make some oppressors friends to other oppressors. We make some oppressors rulers over other oppressors. We set some oppressors upon other oppressors. The verse is suitable for all 3 of these meanings. When someone helps an oppressor, in the end, Allah brings them together and punishes the helper with that same oppressor. Now, unfortunately, in the Islamic Ummah, we have the problem of losing our principles. When the oppressor is one of us, we turn a blind eye. When the oppression comes from us, we try to find an excuse for it. For example, our brother just asked a question, right? A country, Syria, for example, celebrated October 29th. Is that right? When the oppressor is one of us, people are at a loss for how to cover it up, how to justify it, how to legitimize it. Look, brother, wrong is wrong. If this is done in Syria, it's wrong. If this is done in Afghanistan, it's wrong. If this is done in Turkey, it's wrong. If a Christian does it, it's wrong. If a Muslim does it, it's wrong. Wrong is wrong. This was the greatest value that Islam's Prophet brought to this community. To stand by what is right, to follow the truth because it is the truth, to oppose falsehood, to oppose it because it is falsehood. But unfortunately, that's not the case where we are now. We've become hooligans, we've turned into a community of fanaticism. When the oppression comes from our own, we always find an excuse, we find a cover for it. But when someone else does it, we say whatever comes to our mind, whatever we feel like. This is one of the spiritual punishments that has befallen Sudan. But out of everything I've said, I'm telling you the most important one. If a community does not have a political authority, an imam, a caliph who will look after its interests, make decisions on its behalf and mobilize its armies, then that community is doomed to be trampled underfoot. In other words, a community without an imam, without political authority, is a community that is considered non-existent. It exists only on paper, only in names and on tongues, but in reality it has no true existence. As I said, Gaza, before we could even heal Gaza's wounds, before we could fully discuss Gaza, a brand new problem, a brand new agenda has come before us. Right now, this is what we are talking about. Of course, we will make an effort to heal this wound. There is no doubt about that. But we must not forget this either. If we do not focus on the real reasons why we are in this situation, we are only deceiving ourselves. It would be like giving aspirin to a cancer patient. That is why the top priority and agenda for Muslims is for Islam to attain political authority. There needs to be an authority, a government that will raise the banner of Islam, wage jihad under this banner, and bring relief to the oppressed around the world. Otherwise, we will stop talking about Sudan and start talking about East Turkestan. Then we will stop talking about East Turkestan and start talking about Kashmir, about Arakan. And so it goes. This oppression will never end. My wish from my Lord is that we are free from this oppression. We are enemies of those who commit this oppression. We stand with all the oppressed, with all the downtrodden. May Allah, the Mighty and Majestic, accept this testimony from us. May He employ us as well when punishing these oppressors. May He use us too, so that my Lord, glorious and exalted is He, includes us among those blessed servants whom He uses to erase oppression from this earth. And may my Lord, glorious and exalted is He, grant us all the blessing of living under a political authority that considers the interests of the Muslim community, makes decisions on behalf of the Islamic Ummah, and allows us to live under its protection and witness it.